Welcome to Arash's World. Today we have a very special guest. We have David Scharff, who's going to be with us, and he is another recipient of the Sigourney Award, our third one here in our series. Welcome to Arash's World.
Thank you, Arash. Glad to be here.
Now, David, if you can start presenting yourself a little bit, introducing yourself, how would you describe yourself here very briefly in a few words? What would you say?
Well, I'm a psychoanalyst and family and couple therapist as well. I've been doing this for a lot of years now. My wife, Jill Savege Scharff, and I just received the Sigourney Award, which we feel very honored about. We got it for promoting not just the use of distance analysis and distance education, although I think that's what they really focused in on. But we really have developed a whole kind of a matrix, a learning matrix, which started out with the institute that we founded 25 years ago, that is built on educational lines that really use analytic principles to organize the educational process, especially those from object relations, psychoanalytic theory, which means that processes are reciprocal. That is, they're basically relational in the general sense of the relational term. And that, for instance, the teaching we do is best if we are also expecting to learn. So our institute is a teaching and learning community, for instance. And that became really a worldwide community as we use the distance technology to expand beyond the shores of the United States to Central America first, and then to Europe, and most recently, Russia and China.
Now, this is innovative. This is remote treatment is something that we've seen over the past few years, but you've done this way ahead of time. So you've thought really ahead. And so, yeah, how did you come up with this idea? What was the impetus to taking on technology to do teaching? And
the impetus was that we recognized very early on, 35, 40 years ago, that psychoanalytic training particularly, but psychotherapy training of a serious nature was limited to big cities. And that people really couldn't get it unless they were prepared to relocate. And so starting in about 1989, when I was the director of a place called the Washington School of Psychiatry, which was a psychotherapy training center in Washington, D.C., we organized programs for people to travel into. We had a first class with, I think, about 45 students who came from all over the country and Canada and overseas, especially Central America at that point, Panama particularly. And that was successful as a distance learning program, but people had to travel. So they would come into us for 2 weeks in the summer and then 4 long weekends. And that worked. But we recognized that we really needed to do more. And as soon as distance technology became a possibility, we decided, and this was actually Jill's idea, she said, really, you can have centers in other cities that are kind of satellite centers for a training program where people sort of draw the strength of the program from the center in Washington, because that's where we are. But that this begins to spread. So when I left, we were both teaching at the Washington School. We left there in 1994, and with the help of colleagues who'd been working with us, set up, I think, 4 centers originally, one of which was in Panama, in Central America. And then we realized that there was this new technology. Now, it worked initially via the intranet, which was a parallel to the internet, specifically for business, for professional use. That is no longer necessary, but it was in the beginning. And we joined London, our colleagues in London, especially at the Tavistock Center in the Tavistock Clinic, where both of us had trained. And our group in our satellite in Salt Lake City and Long Island with Washington. So that was what the technology would support without being enormously expensive. It was just expensive, not enormous. And so we began using what now is the precursor to what you and I are doing at the moment of talking by Zoom. And we did that. And as the technology improved, we could include more centers in this. So it went to 6. And then all of a sudden, then we had this new technology that meant you could be connected to really virtually an infinite number of other places. So we were early adapters. We've been doing it for more than 20 years. In the last days of the 20th century, we were already doing this. One of my board members said to me, there really is a significant advantage in being the second person to do something. But actually we were the first. And
it's amazing. I have huge respect for pioneers, but it was kind of interesting because I was reading an article from 2000, actually, a newspaper article that talked about the internet and said the internet is a fad, it won't last, people will not like it. And I'm just thinking how wrong they were. And I always appreciate people who look ahead and come up with these ideas, and they don't just go with the flow of people. And one thing I must say that there must have been a lot of resistance, not only back then, but even now there has been resistance until recently, until COVID.
Oh, I think there still will be resistance.
And I was one of those who would resist myself. I'm an instructor. And when we were told to teach languages with technology over the internet, I said, no, I will not accept it, but I had to. I was forced into it. And now I wouldn't want anything else. I think it has huge potential, and I'm a convert now. I've been converted to technology, but that's why I appreciate so much more that people like you and your wife have looked ahead and have gone with this, even though it wasn't cool back then, even though it wasn't popular.
Well, the teaching was all right. Nobody minded the teaching. And we discovered that we could do most of what we could do in person. We still like being in person with our students and our faculty. We really miss, especially the social connectedness that comes with being able to have a cup of coffee or a drink or whatever together. We really miss that. And our students miss that. But the learning part of it can go on very well using these new technologies and Zoom and so on. Zoom turns out to be the best one at this point, but there were others, WebEx and Doxyme and so on. They're all make it possible. The resistance was not to teaching remotely, it was to treating remotely. And especially the IPA, which is a very conservative organization, basically. I mean, not that everybody in it is conservative, but as an organization, it drags its feet and is rather elitist. It does so in the service of saying the standards have to be maintained, of course, and we believe in the standards very, very much. They were against it until the day when the pandemic hit. Then they were right out of the box promoting how to do distance treatment best. And they've been very good about that. But they are expecting to go back to all in-person treatment, at least for their trainees. And that isn't going to happen.
I don't think so.
We've done surveys. So I'm part of a committee for American Psychoanalytic, and we've used that to do a survey of what clinicians think, analytically oriented clinicians, analysts and analytic therapists. And 80% of them were doing hardly any distance treatment before the pandemic. So only about 20% were doing any significant number of hours per week using distance technology. Well, now essentially nobody thinks they're going back to all in-person treatment. They also think, and we have not surveyed the patients because, of course, we don't want access to the patients whose names are confidential and so on. But the clinicians say that their patients are telling them they don't want to go back to all in-person treatment. Most of them like being in person, but there are all these problems of how long the commutes are, especially in big cities. So New York City, Los Angeles, but even worse in Mexico City or Tokyo or Shanghai and Beijing, where I know lots of people. The commutes are a couple of hours often. Well, now people can get treatment and they can do it more intensively because they don't have to use all that time, all that dead time. So it's here to stay. And I,
this is also with a lot of physicians too. And you have like family doctors who were against it, and now they've been doing it. They don't want to go back to the old, and they want to continue to, at least in a hybrid way. And that's been, again, my experience too, both and on the teaching side, as well as my students. A lot of them really like it, and quite a few actually prefer it. And I was surprised to see that the results were generally actually better in terms of languages. The pronunciation was better, and I guess it helps to have those headphones and to listen more carefully. So, and the potential too of what you can do with it by adding things, by getting them to do stuff and then talking about it online. And again, the lack of distraction. And there seems to be like more distraction in the classroom in person as an instructor for me than when it's done remotely. Of course, but there's this prejudice against working from home. And I think that's something that we need to deal with, where people think that if you are working from home, you're not doing anything. You have to be in the office to be considered working. And I think that is something that we have to move over. That needs to move over. We've passed it. We're in a new age now, and we have to adapt to the times. That's the old way of thinking.
Well, this is okay. So this is a whole other area about you're raising, which doesn't apply to psychoanalysts and psychotherapists so much, in that we've been alone in our offices with one or a few patients, a group, a treatment group, or a couple or family. But so that's not so relevant to us. I know it's a whole other area of how much will people want to be in an office together, and how much do they want to not have to face their commute or whatever that the world is going to have to work out. And it's probably not going to be good for commercial real estate brokers, but I understand even there are segments of that community that have done very well. Self-storage is a real estate area that's done very, very well. For instance, but the other thing, I think, just to go beyond the use of technology, is that I think it's true that it enables us to be in touch with our students in a more efficient way. That is one of the silver linings. They don't have to spend a lot of time commuting. This loss of personal contact in the room together, though, that's a big issue. Now, one place that's come into play is for those of us who are training people in other countries, where the word hybrid is a problem, not for the reasons you were mentioning, that is, some in person and some in the room together. We all like that, but where some students are at a distance and others are in the room, that turns out to be not so good. Probably not good for either group, but then we face the problem of, all right, how do we train the students from China or Russia? Because we want them on an equal footing. They want the training. There's more and more training available in China, but it's not up to the standard of the West, and won't be for some significant amount of time. And they're very good students, and they're very devoted. How are we going to put them on an equal footing? Well, we're wrestling with that, and that still has to be worked out.
It's also the reach of thinking, like, we are a global community, and technology has shown that, because we're connected in ways we've never been connected before. And that is truly amazing that I can have interviews with people across the world. To me, I still cannot fully understand it, fathom it. It's so impressive that people in different areas are talking at the same time, and they can have a conversation and they can teach each other. I think we often don't value the things we have enough, and the potential it has. Of course, it can go in wrong directions, and even things like social media. And as a psychologist, as a psychoanalyst, you know that is an issue. But at the same time, it has its benefits as well in terms of connecting with others, in terms of sharing what you're going through and the difficulties, or even looking for help using that platform and so on. So you get the both sides. And I like to focus, and that's just my outlook in general, on the positive side, and not to beat technology for its shortcomings.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I've been giving a training program in China since 2010. I'd been going before that, but and we would go twice a year for 6 days each to Beijing. And then the students would come in from all across China, and they liked it, and I loved going. But of course, we haven't been able to do it in the last 2 years. And we're not sure when we can again. It's not just COVID, it's also, our governments aren't getting along so well. So it's not so good. Our people to people, we continue to get along really well. I love our Chinese colleagues, and they want what we have to teach, but they also like it that we want to learn about them. So my most recent book is Marriage and Family in Modern China. It's a psychoanalytic take on the Chinese family, which is in very rapid evolution. The marriages are and the families are, from the point of view, not just many years of trauma to all Chinese people, but also the one-child policy so they went from very large families to very small families. And now the government wants them to have more children, but mostly they don't want to do that. Turns out children are expensive everywhere. And, and they know that. And in all modern countries, the families are small now because people have careers that they want to invest in, because children are expensive, and so on. Well, I want to learn about these things. I learn about them better by being there, because we can have these kind of private, intimate conversations that you just tend not to have on Zoom. But for actually teaching the classes, I can be there more frequently. We have more continuity of training than when I was just going a couple of times a year. Most people didn't like those long airplane rides, 13 and a half hours. I happen to like them. I get a lot of work done, but there is something nice about not having to get on the airplane quite so frequently.
Yeah, for me, the airplane, I like the flight. I like just getting there and making sure everything is fine. That additional stress, I don't like, and customs and all that.
That's a little harder.
But we skip, there's so much time we save just because of not commuting, not going to this place, and so on. Definitely a benefit here. I'd like to switch and focus more on psychoanalysis, which is something that I've been very passionate about, especially over the past 3-4 years in my life, when I've truly discovered it. I've always known about it. I had read about it. I had studied it. But when you realize that what it can do, the tremendous impact it has on our health, on our mental health, on our overall health, physical health as well, it's astounding. And in many ways, I like to think, and I would say it saved my life in many ways.
Sorry.
Sure. And
yeah, go ahead.
And it's just like opened my eyes, and it liberated me in astounding ways. And it's mostly with the unconscious, because it's something that it was frowned upon for many years, and people said, no, that doesn't exist, or Freud is wrong, and this. And with now more and more research, with learning more about brain science, neuroscience, and people are coming in the right direction. They're joining psychoanalysis in many ways. At least they're taking parts of it and incorporating it into their own way of doing things. And I think that's a good thing. But for me, it was when I talked to somebody I respected, and I talked about the unconscious, and he's a psychologist and who teaches with me. And he said, yes, it's true. And just kind of that confirmation, that affirmation too, that there is something to it. This is real, and we can deal with it, and we can actually, it can really help us in ways we had not thought before, was very, very liberating.
Well, good. I'm glad you're not a convert. You've been a lifelong advocate for it, and you just know more about it over time. I think it's the most sophisticated of the psychotherapies. That Freud really discovered something that endures. Even those therapies that say they're better than analysis really have drawn a core from analysis. For instance, cognitive therapies. Mm-hmm. What they've done is take the cognitive piece, because a lot of what Freud discovered was the capacity to think about these things in a cognitive way. That's certainly part of it. My main criticism of the cognitive therapies is they take part of it and they leave out what I think is the richest part, which you've just been talking about, which is the unconscious organization of mental life and of our interactions with people, which are really important. And I think that Freud, of course, was wrong about some things. Of course he was. He was a 19th century man, and he took everything he could from 19th century science and applied it. And we've fortunately gone beyond that, but the core of what he discovered is still there.
Exactly. I think it's really harsh to criticize somebody from a different generation, from a different time frame. And it's like, and of course, nobody is perfect and nobody can get everything right. But what he found, when we look at that, it's immense. It's as big as Darwin, or even bigger in my view, because it's
these are
huge discovery.
But I think they actually are of a piece. I mean, in the sense of really applying the scientific mind to these major questions of biology, actually. And we, of course, are biological creatures.
So why would you think science is so hesitant? Because the term analysis involves thinking, it involves analyzing and all that. Why is there this barrier?
Well, there's a history to this. I think one part of the history is that analysts as a group during the 20th century were so anti-scientific themselves. They'd said, no, we can't prove this. It's intuitive, and you just have to take our word for it. That is really a very short-sighted stance, because there's plenty of science to support what we're doing as analysts and analytic therapists. That's been very well documented now. For instance, the discovery of mirror neurons in neuroscience, which I can see you know about. Now, we had been using in object relations theory, we use the central concepts of projective identification and introjective identification, which many Freudians, that is the classical American group, said that's nonsense and it's magic to think that you can put part of yourself into somebody else's mind. That's magic. Well, it turns out it's biology, that our minds are built, of course they're built, to read other people's minds. That's what we do. We read other people's emotions 10 times faster than we understand their cognitive messages, their verbal messages. We're much better as a race at reading what people are thinking, because we read their face, we read their eyes, we read their tone of voice, we read their body posture, and we do it all unconsciously. You have to, because you got to know if somebody really doesn't like you, for instance. And you've got to have a pretty good capacity for predicting that based on the way they are saying things and the way they send messages and so on. Well, that's complete scientific support for projective identification. That is, that we can take parts of our inner world and get it across the ether into the mind of the other person. That's how mothers and babies communicate, and it's how spouses and families communicate. Well, Freud didn't know that. He knew people were communicating. He had the metaphor of that the analyst should tune himself, men, of course, should tune himself to the other person like a radio antenna. Well, that's a very good metaphor for it. Of course it is. But he didn't know what the science could possibly be, because neuroscience wasn't there. Now it is. And so we've got many more kinds of things that Mark Solms and others have done in neuropsychoanalysis. Is wonderful support. And now, fortunately, people are really doing outcome studies that support the idea that analytic therapies are at least as good as the other therapies. They're at least as good as drugs. They're actually better, especially in the way that what somebody gets from an analytic therapy, and I don't mean just 4 or 5 times a week, but an analytic therapy is they keep growing even after they've stopped going to therapy. And that one parameter is so much stronger than the other therapies that it really outranks them by a lot. We are trying to teach people to grow.
I have a personal example for that, because I've been suffering from high blood pressure, and my family physician was kind of trying to nudge me towards taking drugs. And I'm in this case, I'm against drugs because I think there's a reason for me having high blood pressure, and I need to find that reason and deal with it, because just taking medication is like, okay, the symptom is gone, but my issue is still there. So the high blood pressure will always exist, and I'm dependent on this medication. So I said, I'm going to do it my way. And that's when psychoanalysis really helped me. And so talking about projections, that was my issue, because I was projecting things onto people that came from my childhood. And I used to think that my bosses were my parents, and I would be intimidated by them and so on. So once this came into the clear for me, and I realized what the issue was, I was able to deal with my stress, my fear. And last time I went to get my blood pressure checked, my family physician was amazed. She said, "How did you do it?" And psychoanalysis.
Good for you. I also take the medication for blood pressure, but I'm a little older than you are, and my body is getting on with things. But I think in every other way, I agree with you that we have these capacities. The brain is definitely controlled by emotion, and so much of it is malleable to these ways. And it's not all what we cognitively understand, because analysis is not, as I said, not just a cognitive process. I think it really has to do with maturing the emotional capacity of the person. The other thing I wanted to say, Arash, is I really like doing analysis, and I do more of that clinically than I do of anything else. I told you I do family and couple work. I see children. I think the main thing about doing formal, very intensive analysis is that it really is where our ideas come from in this field, and that it really has always been the place that seeds the rest of analytic therapy. So in terms of my efforts, I felt it was more important to really train the largest possible number of well-trained analytic psychotherapists, most of whom see people once or twice a week, or they see them in groups, or they see them in families and as a couple and so on. But the depth of the ideas comes from those of us who also do formal analysis. And I think that is, among other things, our laboratory. It is good treatment. I think it's the best treatment for many people, not for everybody, but for many people. And it really is where we can test out these ideas in the depth of unconscious understanding. But at the same time, if we don't do research, we will have had it.
Absolutely. What do you think is the main problem with families? I mean, to me, like, when dysfunctional families seems to be the norm. Like when I compare myself, my wife's family, and then people I talk to, if they're being truly honest, there's a lot of trauma going on within families. So how can we manage a way that it doesn't happen, that we can have a family that is supportive, that is united? And what would be the issue here, the main issue, why we have so many dysfunctional families? In your research and your experience?
Of course, you're asking a very complex question. There are many, look, there are really a lot of healthy families out there, and they do things in lots of different ways. What we think is that a family that can provide a secure base, in John Bowlby's language, the developer of attachment theory, which I think is a very important set of theories which came from analysis but was researched and is still researched, that those families, those parents, often couples, not always couples, who can provide security to their children, who can give their children the freedom to grow while at the same time giving a very secure base. Those are the families that can overcome various traumatic incidents that happen to the children or to the adults. And they really exist. We don't see so many of them clinically. We only see them clinically if the kind of challenge comes to them that anybody couldn't manage alone. Severe illness of a child, for instance, or a death of a child. Then we'd see them. But otherwise, we see the ones who had real challenges to the development of their family or their children and so on. Now, you're absolutely right. The world is a traumatizing place these days, more and more maybe, or more and more we're aware of how often it's been traumatizing. We know there are whole populations in this country and abroad where trauma was the rule. The inner city Black population has been hugely at risk because of poverty, because of the history of slavery, which through intergenerational transmission of trauma has brought the trauma right through to them. All of this and other populations too. Immigrant populations, immigration just being an at-risk issue. I mean, of course, we rely on immigrants, and I think you and certainly I am descended from immigrants. Of course I am. My wife is an immigrant from Scotland. Well, there are all these factors that put people at risk in our country: race and poverty, and being targeted in various ways, as well as the ordinary things life deals: illness, going to war. Anybody who goes to war is at risk for huge trauma, and their children are going to be at risk for that being passed on to them. And this affects our families. Plus, the family structure has changed radically in the last 50 years, 100 years. So we don't expect that every family has two parents who've been together since they were in their 20s. We know that there are single parent families, there are blended families, divorced families, adoptive families. These families all have different challenges and are more prone to trauma that just can happen to them. So I think we have it's one of the things that's new. I think we all know, you probably know, that Freud rejected the trauma theory of neurosis early in his theorizing. He didn't really reject it, but he stopped being interested in it, having posited that sexual trauma was at the root of all neurosis. He gave that up, and it was right to give it up because it's not at the root of all neurosis. When there is sexual trauma or physical trauma to children, that is very, very important and determinative of what people suffer from. But what he discovered by giving it up was that we could do terrible things to ourselves in our minds with the vicissitudes of fantasy life. Now, it turns out more of that is influenced by the family we grow up in than he thought theoretically. His clinical case studies are full of all the data that I need to understand the families of the patients he was using as his analytic case studies. The case of Dora, which is one of the early case studies of a hysterical personality. He's got all the family data, but he didn't use it theoretically. But it's all there. So we can see what he actually was doing clinically was fully responsive to these things. Well, almost fully. There were some things he didn't know. He thought, I don't know if you know the Dora story, but he thought that a young girl of 14 should really be flattered that an older man wanted to get sexual with her, and that she shouldn't be disgusted, she should be flattered, and so on. Well, it's not true. It's a trauma, and he didn't understand that. But he got a lot right about that. And really, clinically, he was better than I think he was theoretically.
And there's a lot of misconceptions about what a family should do and the roles and the way people should be educated, children should be educated. And when I think of like behaviorism, of the idea is like, yeah, give a handshake to your son, don't hug them, and I think it's nonsense, and it creates trauma. And this is what I would say is unnecessary trauma, because you are hurting somebody who loves you, and all they need is your love, your respect, your attention. And a lot of families are not doing it, and it's a very simple thing, and it's across all nations, cultures, races. It's very simple, but a lot of people are resistant to that, and they have all these false notions about what a family should be, and children being independent. That means you don't have to deal with them, you don't talk to them, they have to figure it out for themselves. all these like misconceptions that we have. That's one thing I want to mention, but there's also another thing that as you were speaking. It's something that's been, I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years, especially even before COVID actually, that we go to the doctor when we're sick. We go to the psychologist or a psychotherapist or psychoanalyst when something is not working well. And it's like usually something severe, like you were saying. But I think everybody would benefit from it. This should be something, it's like just enhancing your life. There's so many people, and myself included, who I think suffered from mild depression. It's still not helping me to love life and to live life to the fullest. But I would not, it's not as extreme that I needed to go and see a specialist, but I was just getting by. And so I think we need to open this up. And this is not something that only if you're suffering, you go there, but if you're not having a lot of fun in your life, if you're not enjoying your life, if you're not living it to the maximum, then go see them. Because if I look back, when I was a teen, I wish I had talked to a psychoanalyst because my love life back then would have been so much better. If I could just travel back in time with my knowledge today, I would just say to myself, my teen version, go see an analyst and you'll be successful with the girls.
Yeah, I can't promise that. I partly agree with you. Partly, I think it's too much, of course. We're not going to provide this kind of intensive mental health service for just the sort of people who are unhappy from time to time. But I think there are a lot of people who really could use the help. I completely agree with you. I think if you're not happy, that is actually, and I don't mean giggling all the time, but if really life is a real struggle for you, of course, if you're hungry and poor, that's the first thing. But I think there are plenty of people who it's not those basic provisions. They just are unhappy too much of the time, and they should talk. They clearly should talk to somebody. I think there are other things in terms of applied analysis that should be more in the drinking water. I think these healthy principles that you're talking about, I think really a kind of public education process about, all right, what is a family for? What can you do to help your children thrive? And I think families are really basic across the world are for two things. They're to help each person, each individual in the family develop at each stage of life, from infancy through old age. The family is the container for their healthy development. And it should provide the people in the family with the needs that we all have for intimate relationships. I mean, those two large categories. It should help everybody function in the optimal way, developmentally and in it being able to work if work is what's at issue. Now that's a very broad definition, so the specifics in any culture are going to differ.
I read a book, Simon Baron-Cohen wrote a book, and where he talked about the importance of the first 5 years of a child's life. And of course, well, that's a huge issue with Freud too. But he said, if we can give our child the security, emotional security, the safety, the confidence in those first 5 years, it's like giving them gold. It's like you are making sure that the future will be prosperous. Just really the first 5 years, if we focus our attention on them, it's going to help them in so many ways. Then we see parents who let them cry, who don't attend their children, who send them to preschool. And I understand the reasons there, but I'm thinking this is not helping them in many ways.
Let me engage with you a little bit about this. I agree that the first 5 years are the foundation for everything that follows. You just can't quit then. You still got to keep.
Of course not. Of course not. Yeah.
But I think you were talking about love and don't let them cry and so on. Look, there are two basic components to parenting and relating. And one is to invite the love and to offer the love. That's one crucial overarching need. At the same time, parents need to set limits. So I also see parents who won't let their child cry himself to sleep. And as a result, the child never learns how to go to sleep. You've got to be able to let your child cry in an ordinary way. The child said, but I want you to hold me and not ever put me down. No, that's not a good idea either. I'm using that as a kind of silly exaggeration, but setting limits is an equal part of parenting in a loving but firm way. And I see lots of families where the parents are so anxious that the child will feel rejected that they can never say, you have to go to bed now. Or they can't say, I'm not giving you a lollipop 10 minutes before dinner. We're not doing that. To teach the child to be more self-reliant. I don't mean just raising themselves without parental support, but self-reliant also. And that to be able, for instance, for a child to be alone in the presence of a loving parent, but to be alone and read a book, play with toys. A child should be able to play alone as one option, but not have to always be alone.
I completely agree with you, and that's definitely true. It's like, yes, and as a father myself and as an instructor, I know it's like you have to give freedom, but you also have set limits and you have expectations that they have to fulfill. But the environment, though, is with my son. I have a teen son, he's 13. The environment has always been open, and I express your views and I will accept them. I will respect them. I might not agree with them in many ways, but you're open to express them. And so that has created an environment that now I kind of regret at some points where he's criticizing me openly without fear. And most of the time is actually correct. And that moves us away from the authoritarian parents to parents, I think, that should be more flexible about it. We work as a team. Of course, we're in charge. We're not the same. We're not equal. But at the same time, we have to give them space and freedom to express themselves, to develop themselves, to find their own identity and not keep pushing them in certain preset directions that we have or our own wishes that we project onto them. And I see a lot of parents who are actually doing that. And I feel sorry for the kids because I say, I wish you were my kid because that would not happen in our home. And so I'd like more people to be aware of that. And that a lot of it comes, in my view, from trauma that they had from their parents, and you get into that cycle, but we have to break that cycle. We have to stop it at some point. And it is our responsibility to do so, each person. And it's not something, I think people also victimize themselves. And I think we have to really move on and find another way of doing things, because it doesn't give you an excuse to continue the same. This has always been like this. And I say, well, now is your chance to become a pioneer and to do something differently.
Well, look, I agree with you. I want to add in, though, that there really are a lot of different styles that can result in healthy development.
I agree.
And some people are more authoritarian, but I'm not talking about being brutally authoritarian. They're saying, nope, this is the way we do it in our family, and those kids can turn out just fine, and they'll be a little more authoritarian than some other kids, or maybe they'll rebel and they won't be. But I don't want to close the door on people who just don't do it the way I think. I see a lot of people who are pretty good at the way they do it. For instance, all those cultures that have done arranged marriages. It's not a bad system.
It depends, but yes, I agree with you. It depends again. Yeah.
I think older parents thinking about what's going to make a happy couple have a lot more life experience than people who are 20 years old thinking they know everything and that romance will last forever. I mean, in this country, that's our system. And we've got experience with it now for maybe 100 years, but, or maybe 200, but it's not an unmitigated good. And I think that we can accept that there are different systems for promoting development and then really try to think inside the system.
Yes. I think one of the issues that we think in binary ways, and we always think like individualism or collectivism, and that's it, you pick one. But I like both. And I like somewhat the middle ground. And it's like, sometimes, yes, I think individualism is more important, but we also see during COVID now, we do have to hang in there together. We do have to stick together. We have to help each other out. And it's not about like one person's rights that could override the rights of others. We have to find a balance there. And people are quite stuck. It's one or the other. And
look, I see this in the work in China. China is a, and I don't mean in a communist sense, it's a collectivist society. It's always been that the morality is built on loyalty to the family and the group. That's always been true for 2,500 years in a good way. And they have, in a way, a more selfless idea of what a person should be. They're moving away from that to a more individualistic society, more like ours. It's not exactly the same. But really, I feel I've learned a lot by being immersed in that ethic, which is so different from the American ethic of, you have to be an individual who has to take care of himself. And it's nice if you relate to your family, but you're on your own, sort of.
But then the Asian cultures have this idea as your parents basically decide for you. It's not just arranged marriages, it's also for your future, your career, and so on. And that's where I think, no, that is where I stick to individualism.
I'd say there, if the parents really have their child's well-being in mind, it's not all bad. That's not the world I live in. Of course, that system is collapsing anyway. So to the regret of some of the older parents who feel, wait, I did what my parents said. Why isn't my child doing what I say? Well, it's because the world has changed. And the Chinese world has changed too. I'm not talking about the politics, just the rapid evolution into a more individualistic society than they're used to. It's a problem for them because they don't actually quite know yet how to live that way. It's going to take them some time. We've had time. In the West too. I mean, parents used to make a lot of decisions for young people. Not much anymore.
What role, just to kind of come back to our first discussion, what role does technology play in all of this and these changes in terms of family structure and kind of this global community that we talked about? How important is technology for that in all its forms and methods?
Well, we're talking about the cultural effects of the technology rather than just the practical effects.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think the obvious thing is that people are exposed to a world influence every day, even in countries that try to restrict that. But certainly in Europe and the Americas, people are openly influenced by so much that they're flooded. And it's hard for them. I think it's hard for people to hang on to a core that helps them be organized, whatever that is. I mean, the core of their family values or their religious values or their kind of national values. It's harder to do that because they're so buffeted. Then, of course, in these countries with authoritarian governments that are trying to control the information, I think people are sensing a kind of constriction. And that technology is kind of it's a seduction. They can see it would offer more, but they can also see the government trying to limit it. And I think then it becomes part of this traumatizing picture. And of course, it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's opened up the world in all the ways you and I have been talking about. It also has opened up the opportunities for trauma. If you just take, for instance, the way kids are traumatized through the apps that they're on, and they get bullied so much more easily and thoroughly than they used to, or somebody in a state 1,000 miles away can reach out and traumatize a kid who lives nearby. All of that is also there. So I think it's harder to find and I don't mean this in a moralistic sense, but a moral center. For kids growing up, that they're open to so many influences that are a quantum leap more than used to be.
One experience that has been equalizing in terms of trauma and suffering has been COVID, because when we talk about it, everybody no matter where you are, can relate to it in some ways, and some even more than others because of the experiences they've had and painful experiences they've had and the losses and so on.
Yeah.
But if we think about it, and I like to see the positive things of the positive side of things, is a lot of us haven't experienced famine or war or anything, but this is one thing that can unite us. And in terms of trauma and suffering, and we can empathize with others if again we choose to do so, and that is a benefit that has come from this situation. That it's kind of brought us closer globally. And so, and the trying to solve this issue together, like before I used to think the only like issue when humanity comes together would be when aliens try to attack us. Then we get together and try to fight against them. But now it's a different kind of issue. It's a pandemic.
Yeah, well, I think you're right that it has been an equalizer in some ways, although people with an adequate means have done okay, and those who are in poverty have really taken hits over and over again. But I think it's true, aside from the polarization, which has been so difficult, traumatizing to us as a country, that we are in it together worldwide. We're in it together, and we can have sympathy. And I certainly experienced this in the beginning, right in the beginning, that my Chinese colleagues and friends reached out to us. Even though it started there, they got on top of it faster. And they were sending masks and telling us their experience and really being supportive to us. It was quite marvelous. But it's a mixed bag.
Yes, as always.
Yeah.
So well-deserved congrats again to your prize at the Sigourney Award, which is an award here recognizing your contribution and your partner's contribution to psychoanalysis and for the benefit of humankind. And I read, would you consider yourself a physician psychoanalyst? Would
yes,
that be a term? And I love that, because for me, like interdisciplinary studies and bringing things together, uniting things, adding psychoanalysis to areas that we hadn't previously, I find that fascinating. And
one thing I didn't mention, I should always mention, is I've been part of a project from our institute to give away psychoanalytic and psychotherapy books worldwide free.
Wonderful.
Jill and I have been editors for this thing that our old publisher, Jason Aronson, started and has funded. And we've given away more than 2 million downloaded books in over 200 countries and territories, free. And people write and say, God, thank you. I could never afford these books in India and Pakistan and worldwide. So I think this kind of capacity is something that's now available to us that really can spread not just the word, but the whole ethic of trying to, the world being better if we can understand ourselves.
And thank you for contributing to that. Thank you so much for being on Arash's World. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Arash. It's been fun for me. All right. Bye-bye.